I'm Sarah, and one of my favorite shapes is a trapezoid. And I bet there's something a lot of you don't know about trapezoids, and it's connected to the 2022 Minnesota Math Standards that will be fully implemented in the 27-28 school year. And today I want to talk to you about a fourth grade benchmark, benchmark 4.2.4.3, that says, I'm just going to give you a glimpse into it of that first part where it says sort and classify quadrilaterals in a hierarchy including squares, rectangles, trapezoids, ooh, there's my favorite shape, rhombi, parallelograms, and kites. So let me tell you a little bit about why I love trapezoids. If you're like me, when you were growing up in school and you were asked to define trapezoids, when you learned about trapezoids, you probably learned about them, thought about them in the same way I did for a long time in my life until my mind was blown maybe 10 years ago. And if I said define trapezoid right now, if I asked most people, they probably, if they live in America, would say a trapezoid is a shape with exactly one pair of parallel sides. It's quadrilateral with exactly one pair of parallel sides. In fact, the picture in your mind is probably going to be similar to the picture that I have. The short sides on the top, the long sides on the bottom. It's oriented this way. And if you saw it upside down, you'd be like, oh, like some of your students might not think that's a trapezoid. And for sure, that's not a trapezoid. In fact, all of these are trapezoids. They're all quadrilaterals with exactly one parallel set of parallel sides. But what if I told you that forever, a lot of the world has thought about a definition of trapezoid that's different than this? In fact, if you look it up in Wikipedia right now, you'll see in Wikipedia that a trapezoid can be defined two ways. It can be defined inclusively or exclusively. So if you've never heard that before, what does that mean? And what does that have to do with Minnesota? Well, most states around the United States have a set of, well, they all have a set of math standards. And in their glossaries, if you look up what they say a trapezoid is in the state, there's some states like Massachusetts that say that a trapezoid has at least one parallel set of parallel sides. That means it can have two sets of parallel sides, which means all of a sudden there are shapes that we call trapezoids in the state of Massachusetts that I would not call a trapezoid. And then there are states like Missouri that say it's exactly one set of parallel sides. And then there's states like Ohio that say both definitions, both the inclusive and the exclusive definition, are allowable in our state math standards. So what's going on in Minnesota? Is Minnesota doing this? Well, this has been a debate going on in American schools for the last over 10 years. A math leader in the nation, Shelby, often would write about it on her blog. And this is one of the pictures I took from her blog. And she said, I really believe it should be thought of it inclusively, because why would we say all of these things are trapezoids, but for the one where there's two sets of parallel sides, we say you're not a trapezoid. And she made arguments for that. And she would post pictures and say, aren't these all lovely trapezoids? Ooh, that square then would be a trapezoid because it has at least one set of parallel sides. And so as we think about the attributes, but then there were other mathematicians like Zach who would be on social media sending Shelby pictures that look like this and saying, that's a trapezoid. Period. That's the only kind of trapezoid. And so it's been a debate even at national math conferences. You'll see people wearing t-shirts like this where they're advocating for either the inclusive definition of trapezoid or the exclusive definition of trapezoid. And so if you want to know in the new standards, this will be fully assessed on the MCA4s, what the definition of trapezoid will be. In our future standards, this will be in a glossary that will come out by spring of 2026. A trapezoid is a quadrilateral with at least one pair of parallel sides, so that's an inclusive definition. That definition is probably new to a lot of people, teachers and students in the state of Minnesota, but it also includes, it's similar to the Ohio and other states' definitions where both are allowable, a quadrilateral with exactly one pair of parallel sides, and the exclusive definition. That's the one I was the most comfortable with. And districts will be allowed to choose either definition, or I would argue that you should choose both, because Minnesota State MCA 4 items will be written so that either definition is acceptable. And you could hold on and say, I'm just going to do the one, but we're preparing students for a world where they might live in parts of the world where the other one is allowable. Let's be inclusive of all definitions that are acceptable for trapezoids, and do that. So let's talk a little bit about that inclusive definition, where and this is from the Florida Math Standards, where quadrilaterals have at least one pair of parallel sides. And what does that have to do with hierarchies? Because all of a sudden there's a whole bunch of shapes that are like included in the definition of trapezoid. So one of the ways I might present it to students is I might give them a whole lot of shapes like this and say, what do you notice? What do you wonder? And students might notice colors. They might notice that they all have four sides, and we're like, yeah, they're all quadrilaterals. They might notice that there are several shapes that have a green border or a black border. And then there's these two shapes that have a red border. And I did that intentionally because when we rearrange those two shapes, those are the only two quadrilaterals that fit both the exclusive definition of trapezoids and the inclusive definition. By the way, if you go back and look at those shapes, the two with the black border don't fit either definition of a trapezoid. And so it'd be a way for me to introduce both of those sets of ways of thinking about it. In fact, I'm going to link this and some other resources, this PowerPoint to this video. So if you want to steal those slides and use those to introduce your students to quadrilaterals eventually, you certainly could. And then I might ask them to notice and wonder, just without the borders, things that they notice, because we want them to bring out things related to the attributes: equal angles, equal sides, parallel sides, and looking at how quadrilaterals are made, because one of the things fourth graders in the state of Minnesota need to do is think about a hierarchy. And there's a couple different hierarchies that fit depending on your definition of a trapezoid. So let's look at them. If you're using the exclusive definition of a trapezoid, that means exactly one pair of parallel sides. Then there's three different categories of quadrilaterals: trapezoids, parallelograms, and kites. And so all of the other quadrilaterals will have attributes that fit one of those three categories. Notice the arrows are pointing towards that because everything below the quadrilateral has four sides. But there are things like trapezoids that are four-sided but have one set of parallel sides, parallelograms that have two sets of parallel sides, and then that would also include rectangles and rhombi. And then if all their sides are equal, that would also include squares. And then I put a dotted line there because depending on how people make their hierarchies, sometimes they'll put that line in for kite going to rhombus, or they will not. We would then rearrange that a little bit if it was the inclusive definition of a trapezoid, meaning at least one pair of parallel sides. And then at the top, quadrilateral, there would be only two categories, trapezoid and kite, because there would be a lot more things that would be considered trapezoids under that definition. And so as you're thinking about talking to your students about this, you can use a flow chart for a hierarchy like I showed you, or a Venn diagram. But one of the things you want to be bringing out are the attributes of shapes in some ways with your students. You might not in fourth grade be using some of the notations we use in high school for geometric shapes, but you could. You know your students, and whether it's the exclusive or the inclusive definition of trapezoids, you want to be having conversations about what shapes have multiple names in the land of the quadrilaterals that are equally valid. So if you didn't know a trapezoid had two definitions, now you do. And in the new standards, both definitions are going to be acceptable in the state of Minnesota. And so one way that you could work with your students on that after you've had that conversation, this might be a formative assessment prompt that you give students. We've been talking about this. Which of these Venn diagrams represents an inclusive definition of trapezoid? So pause the video and take a look at it, see if you know which one that is. But if you have questions about trapezoids, put them in the comments below, but check out the description. There's lots of resources for you there in the description.